And it is my pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker, Lingqi Yan. Lingqi did his Bachelor of Engineering at Tsinghua University in Beijing, China, and then did his PhD at UC Berkeley under the supervision of Ravi Ramamurthy. During his PhD, he worked at Disney, Autodesk, Weta, and also at NVIDIA, where I had the pleasure of being his colleague. His PhD thesis received the Outstanding Doctoral Dissertation Award at SIGGRAPH 2019, and he has made a stellar career and is now an assistant professor of computer science at UC Santa Barbara, a co-director of the Mirage Lab, and affiliated faculty in the 4ICE Lab. His work covers the full breadth of rendering research: offline and real-time, appearance and light transport, wave optics and neural approximations, glints and denoising, hair and scratches. There's something for everyone. He has excellent connections with both academic and industrial research. As far as I can tell, every major tech company is already funding his work, but if yours is not, you should probably change that. So I'm very honored that you accepted our invitation, and I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you.
Please take it away.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Great. So yeah. First, thanks, Christoph, for the introduction and the invitation. Okay. I actually can't believe this is my first time attending HPG, but it is my true honor to be here. Okay. So in the beginning, Christoph told me that I can talk about everything, right? So, and I said, great, I have an entire hour to complain about how difficult to get funding for rendering research in universities. Okay, all right, but later I changed my mind. So seriously, my research is about photorealistic rendering, and it seems contradictory to high performance because photorealism often means heavy computation, but let me try to relate them today. I will introduce a few recent works of mine, very quickly skimmed over with high-level ideas. More importantly, I plan to raise more questions and share thoughts with you rather than providing solutions, because honestly, I don't have any solutions to either high performance or photorealistic rendering. Okay. So rendering. What is rendering? To me, rendering is the process that turns 3D geometry into images. With different lighting conditions and appearances of materials, we can expect different images. So rendering is computing. Then what is photorealistic rendering? The word photorealistic is clearly made up. We want the rendered images to be realistic. How realistic? As realistic as real photos, like this picture. I bet it's difficult to judge whether it's rendered until you see the 3D model. As I said, when we are pursuing photorealistic rendering, we often have to impose burden to the performance. Why is that? And is it possible that we achieve them both? To answer these questions, I plan to talk 3 parts today. I will first focus on complex appearance and geometry, respectively, and then I will talk more about ideas and thoughts. Let's start with appearance. I used to say shading. I don't know what you think, but I feel that shading nowadays is more involved with light transport rather than the intrinsic optical properties of different materials, which is my understanding of the definition of the appearance. From this definition, we can immediately say that the appearance is definitely not just these images shown here. Why appearance is difficult? I have summarized 3 most important properties of appearance: high dimensional, high frequency, and high rank. High dimensional is relatively easy to understand. A BRDF is 4D, a neural radiance field, or NURF, is intrinsically 4D light field, but since it's no longer defined on the surface, but rather in a volume, it becomes 5D. And for example, a BSSRDF for subsurface scattering is 8D, etc. High dimensional means that it is often difficult to measure, store, and synthesize appearance. And high frequency means that the modern appearance is no longer like diffuse plus specular. It can provide drastically changing pattern over time. And high rank means irregular. For example, we know that the cloth weave pattern is repetitive, but actually, there are no places that are exactly the same. So how do we acquire realistic appearance? Let's recall our high school chemistry and biology courses, because my teacher often say that structure determines function, right? So as I mentioned earlier, since appearance is some optical property or function, to study appearance is to study the underlying structure of certain materials. This study often goes from faraway view or observation all the way down to the microstructure. That's why I name it top-down analysis. To understand how it works, I'll take this work, sponge cake model, as an example. It'll be presented at this year's SIGGRAPH. Why do we want this model? There are different kinds of reflectance models. For example, the foam model that can represent some plastic-looking appearance, and the microfacet model is good at representing conductor and dielectric. We would like to ask, is it possible to find one model that is physically based and does everything, including layering, transmission, sheen, multiple scattering? And our sponge cake can do it. So you can see that the sunlight from outside can go through the two-layered curtain of ours, giving some transmission effects. And when the light only comes from inside the room, for example, in the night, we can see the reflection. And we can also combine them together to get a bright room. So why do we call it sponge cake? Because our model looks like a sponge cake. That's the structure. So we find the common materials share similar layered structures. Each layer has some thickness, and their materials can be different. For example, wood and the varnished layer on top of it. If we ignore the interface between the different layers, it is indeed a sponge cake. So we can derive an appearance model. Given incident and outgoing directions, we can integrate on all possible places along the depth where the light may scatter, and find geometrically how much light is absorbed before, scattered at, and absorbed after the scattering event. So for single scattering, we have a nice analytic model. Later, we have extended this sponge cake work to support surface-based cloth rendering. The cloth is even more complex because of its three-level twisted structure, as you can see from the image on the top right corner. From left to right, fibers twist to form plies, and plies twist to form yarns. And yarns are finally woven or knitted to get a piece of cloth. So traditionally, there's been fiber-based cloth rendering approaches that accurately model and trace individual fibers, and also volume-based methods that turn fibers into scattering properties in a voxel grid. These are relatively accurate methods compared to the surface-based methods, but of course, more costly. So we would like to make the surface-based cloth model better with designed details and a good appearance. And we do this by defining a series of textures on the surface. These textures are tileable and can be either high resolution in the first row or low resolution in the second row. They are able to determine very fine structures of the cloth surface. For example, a cloth is woven or knitted with yarns contacting each other, right? Like in this way. So they cannot produce a watertight surface. So when a ray hits the gap between the yarns, it should go through directly without hitting anything, right? Then it's the structure of the plies twisted together. So basically how the plies will follow the movement of the yarn. We need its per point normal and tangent. And in this way, we do not need to specify any fibers, but we can infer the fiber's direction whenever there is a ray intersection with the ply. Then we can shade as if there are fibers using our sponge cake model. And finally, the surface of the cloth is never flat. Higher places will block rays or eyesights from reaching lower places. So we keep a height field and use a 2D anisotropic Gaussian to approximate the 2D visibility at different places. And in this way, we're able to get a nicely looking cloth on triangle mesh with actual weave patterns, transmission, sheen, and other nice properties. But let's stop for a while. As we can see, the top-down analysis gives us good appearance. But isn't this too complex for fast performance, right? Just like this Linux meme. What we've been doing is equivalent to saying, hey, here's your microstructure. Please go ahead and ray trace yourself. So what should we actually do? So let's take a look at this example. So I had this animal fur project when I was a student. I found that the hair reflectance models are not suitable for animal fur. And I did some research on biology, and I found the structural difference. Unlike human hair, which can be modeled as a glass-like cylinder, like this, the animal fur has very complex internal structures inside. There's cuticle outside and cortex inside, which contains pigments that absorbs light, and the medulla in the center, which scatters light. So if we simply stop here, modeling the inner structures as participating media for each animal fur fiber, theoretically we can trace rays inside. But good luck getting a converged result. So what I did back then was to define a double cylinder model, and I added 2 lobes when the light goes through the medulla or the inner cylinder. When the light hits a fur fiber, the model is used to shade, and the light never needs to get inside the fur fiber. Okay. Therefore, in order to achieve good performance, we need not only digging into the micro world in a top-down manner, but also bottom-up abstraction or summarization after that. Another example, let's take a look back at the sponge cake model again. Okay. So if you remember, the derivation we just talked about is for single scattering. Of course, the analytic mathematical derivation for single scattering is already a bottom-up summarization. But I want to ask, how about multiple bounces? Do we have to perform multiple integrations and enumerate all possible scattering positions for every bounce? And theoretically, we can, but it may not be necessary. If we compare the single scattering results on the left with the multiple scattering results on the right, we can find that they look similar, and multiple bounce results just seem brighter and a bit different. This observation inspires us to tabulate our results. How? With the parameters of each layer defined, we can path trace it to acquire the actual multiple scattered BRDF lobe. Then we can simply fit this multiple scattered lobe with the parameters as if it is a single scattered lobe. Therefore, we end up with a huge dimensional table with infinite pairs of mapping from material parameters to single scattering parameters. Therefore, we can simply use a lightweight MLP to compress it. Speaking of neural networks, they are good at compression, but in the sponge cake model, we still perform path tracing to simulate the multiple scatter results, as we just mentioned. So we ask, is it also possible for a neural network to speed up computation, for example, layering 2 BSDFs into a new one? If we can do that, we're essentially introducing some neural algebra. In this neural algebra, BSDFs can be compressed into latent vectors, and we call them neural operands. And a small neural network can take 2 latent vectors in and output a new one as a neural operator. And in our specific case, the neural operator is essentially taking over the complex layering computation. Let's take a look at the results. Every point on this globe has 2 latent vectors representing the BSDFs of the top and bottom layers, and we use a lightweight neural network to layer them. It's pretty handy to be inferred per point, and the result is also noise-free, which is another advantage using neural networks to compute, unlike the traditional position-free path tracing methods. So I've talked about the performance challenges in appearance. Before we move on to the geometry, I would like to say that appearance and geometry issues are essentially the same. It's just the light transport inside certain materials or inside the entire scene. And they are even intertwined. For example, if we ask why photorealistic rendering is slow, based on our previous analysis, we know that it's because accurate appearance is often involved with complex geometry. For example, the porous structure inside a bread. And in the beginning, we just mentioned what is rendering. So rendering is the process that turns geometry into an image. Therefore, I would like to claim the rendering performance is bounded by the complexity of the geometry. Because the rendering process at least has to see all the geometry. If the geometry has a complexity of, for example, n, the rendering performance would be at least On. And I have an example to support this. Here's an early work of mine from 2014. It uses an extremely high-resolution normal map to specify every microfacet's orientation on the snail's shell. Each microfacet is purely specular. That's why we see the glints. And here's a zoom sequence. It demonstrates that even within a pixel, there are thousands of tiny highlights. Regardless of any possible acceleration methods we can possibly propose, in the end, we need to find all the highlights in a pixel to get a converged, noise-free image. And this observation tells us it's possible that the only way to improve the rendering performance is to decrease the complexity of the geometry or downsampling it. But we have one condition. We need the downsampled geometry to produce ideally the same appearance as before. That means we cannot just throw away the geometry that we cannot see, because if we do so, we immediately go from this vivid photo of a brown bear to an old-fashioned cartoon. So what should we do then? I actually like this example personally. Suppose you're driving in the night. You may notice the small patches around the lanes that are very bright. Why is that? Of course, there are some retro-reflective paintings, but some other designs have this kind of zigzag-shaped microsurfaces. Why is it good? Because in this way, for each incident ray, after bouncing twice, it will be redirected back to its original incident direction. That's why you can find it very bright in the night. But if we do mesh simplification blindlessly, without considering the appearance, what will happen? The result will be a plane. No matter if you do normal map filtering or not, it's no longer behaving like before. So I would like to say that the geometry simplification is no longer a standalone topic today. Simplifying of the geometry must come at the cost of complexifying the appearance. Whatever geometry we want to simplify, we need to aggregate their optical behavior together, both individually and between the geometric primitives. In some cases, for example, triangle mesh combined with diffuse or rough glossy materials, aggregating the appearance may not be an issue even if you don't do anything, just like the masterpiece work of Nanite. But in some cases, this will fail if you don't do anything about the appearance. For example, I've been playing Ratchet and Clank, and I was astonished that the per-strand hair or fur works so well already in video games, although the number of fur fibers cannot be too high, am I right? But what if multiple or hundreds of furry animals appear in the screen at the same time? A simple trick, as you can think of, is to just create fewer and thicker strands when the animal is far away. It makes perfect sense. But when actually applied, as you can see from the bottom left and bottom right corners, the appearance seems too hard, and the color is not matching the middle, which is the reference. Since we have analyzed earlier, we know the reason already, right? With this simplification, each fiber now is representing a bunch, maybe 100 original fibers together. The geometry is simplified, but the appearance is not complexified. it's still using the previous model for individual fibers, which is wrong. So what we did is to simulate the aggregated appearance. We first generate multiple fur fibers in a thick cylinder, then start tracing a beam from behind. Let the light scatter inside, and we record the outgoing radiance. Then we can compare the individual fibers appearance, which is the middle column, against the aggregated appearance on the right. What we can see is that they're generally similar, right? The aggregated appearance is inheriting the individual's appearance to some extent, maybe just dimmer. And it adds a few more lobes, like the big diffusive looking and the top and bottom lobes. So with this experiment, we tried to derive the aggregated fur appearance physically and mathematically, still considering a ray going into a volume of fibers. However, we failed. And that was the first time we realized how difficult traditional volumes, such as microflakes, aren't able to represent real, especially structured geometry. And this is also known as the correlation problem. I will talk about it next. But as a workaround, we thought of our tabulated solution. Still, we just need parameter conversion from individual fibers' appearance together with the statistics, for example, how many fibers will be aggregated together, their density, etc., all the way to the parameters of our aggregated model. Again, we can create the data pairs, train an extremely lightweight MLP. As you can see, only 2 internal layers. Then we immediately have our aggregated model. And based on the view distance, we also come up with the dynamic simplification scheme. So the number of fur fibers will be determined dynamically based on view distance. And also, we infer the neural network once, as long as there's a ray intersection. But still, the inference time only takes up 2% of our total rendering time. So the neural network is indeed simplifying the computation. Okay. You may argue that the difficulty may be from the curves as the geometry primitives. Actually, no. In fact, I have been looking at different representations that may be good at geometry downsampling and appearance aggregation, but there's still no luck for me. For example, the triangles are simple, but they can form complex topology, like the grassland. In this case, it's not easy to find a simple downsampling scheme. Voxelization is a good way to enable level of detail by dynamically selecting the voxel size to be comparable to a pixels. This can also speed up rendering and minimize aliasing, but is voxelization almighty? And the short answer is no. I spent like 1 year to identify 2 big issues on that. The first issue is about the appearance. A voxel is essentially a box, not a point. The light can come into any position from any direction to the box and can go out from any other direction and any other position. This is very much similar to the concept of a BSS-RDF. Therefore, the aggregated appearance of a voxel should be 8D. So how can we quickly perform the aggregation? And how do we store the 8D appearance? And if that's difficult, how can we support dynamic scenes and editable materials? There is one way to simplify the first problem. That is to assume that whenever I use a voxel, it is small enough so the positions inside a voxel can be safely ignored, or we don't distinguish them. This is essentially saying that we don't want a BSS-RDF, we don't want 8D, but instead we want 4D, right? But this will also make a voxel look like a uniform inside with some transparency, maybe directionally dependent. Then in this case, the second problem comes, known as the correlation. Just look at this image. There are 3 opaque surfaces, C1, C2, and C3. When we look from left to right, the voxel containing C1 has a transparency of 50% because the upper part will be blocked. And it's the same for C2. But together, if we have played with Adobe Photoshop, right? So we know that 50% transparency on top of the 50% transparency gives us 25% transparency, which means that we should still be able to see anything behind that, which is C3, this block. However, in reality, you can immediately tell me that C1, C2, together, they will block the light for all. And what's more complex is that if we move C2 up, and that means 50% through the voxel of C1, and also 50% for C2, but together C1, C2, if C2 is moved up, will still give us 50% transparency. Therefore, it is a very difficult problem of the positional correlation, because recording the correlation, as we just analyzed, is indeed keeping all the geometry, which is contradictory to the reason why we need a voxel grid. But why the NeRF is successful then? Well, my personal understanding is that a neural network has the ability to distribute its computational power to the places that are most in need. Therefore, we may assume that the NeRF has virtually infinite resolution, so it's able to represent surfaces well. This is one reason. But getting back to appearance, since NeRF has the light and appearance baked into its representation, it's actually a light field, or sometimes we say a light source. Decoupling these components is another story. It's not yet sure how good they can be. Since I don't have a clue finding good representations for both geometry and appearance, I gave up. And trust me, it feels great. What I'm looking for next is whether I can find a good geometry representation that can help to accelerate ray tracing only, without considering any appearance. Why is that? Because hardware ray tracing is not pervasively available, especially on mobile devices. And distance functions are good alternatives, but they require sphere tracking, or in general, iterations, to move a ray forward. And most importantly, to build a small distance field of, for example, resolution of 64 cubic, it may already take more than 3 milliseconds. So we seek a good solution that is fast in both building and tracing, so it can support dynamic scenes. We come up with a method called ray-aligned occupancy map array, or ROMA, to achieve this. As you can see, it builds 3 times faster and traces twice as fast as distance fields. This is a new work that will be presented tomorrow in EGSR. So in fact, we plan to try both EGSR and HPG deadlines, but unfortunately, we made it before the EGSR deadline. That's the reason. So I'll just very quickly go over it. The highest level idea is that an occupancy map, or bit brick by the industrial friends, is a binary 3D volume that can be easily created using rasterization and stored using a 2D texture, where each texel is a 64-bit or 128-bit number. But tracing array in an occupancy map is still slow, because we still cannot afford iterations moving the ray in a DDA style. But there's only one case when the tracing is very efficient. That is, the ray is traveling right along the depth of one texel. And in this case, ray tracing can be done in O1 using some bit operations. This inspires us, is it possible to create all differently rotated versions of an occupancy map beforehand? So whenever a ray is given, we can always find the occupancy map where the ray goes straight inside a texel. Of course, this is impossible. But instead of generating all rotated versions, we can create an array of limited numbers of rotations. So in this case, given an array, we can find the closest rotated direction and snap it to that direction to perform fast and approximate ray tracing just inside one texel. And to get the different rotated versions, no more rasterization is needed. We just need a computing path to copy-paste the base occupancy map, what we call BOM, into a ROMA. Okay. The spatial resolution of the occupancy map and the number of rotations, which we call the angular resolution, can both be adjusted to trade between quality and speed. And the errors introduced by snapping the rays will be amortized over time with spatial temporal denoising. And we can also choose not to snap the rays if accuracy is the top concern. That's it. And as you can see, our ROMA works pretty well. And we also joked that ROMA wasn't built in a day, but in less than 1 millisecond. Okay. I like this robot. Okay. All right. So that's about my tentative explorations, resolving the performance challenges by appearance and geometry. There are a few random thoughts that I want to share with you. The first one is that, are the details really important to be modeled and studied? So if we look at these two images, I bet it'll take you at least 1 second to figure out that these are not mountains, especially for the right one, but actually the top of 2 wooden stakes. But they are really similar to the actual mountains. So how come that studying the details is crazy, but studying massive scale rendering is good, right? I would say small or large is relative, and the problems and even solutions in different scales may be connected and shared. The other thing I would like to share is that decades ago, when people are talking about photorealistic rendering, that's just about offline rendering. However, I think real-time rendering is undergoing a revolution. And I personally believe that, aside from the improvement of computational power and hardware to do ray tracing, the most important technique is the spatial temporal reuse, and actually temporal reuse. With temporal reuse, appearance models are allowed to introduce quite a bit of noise, and also the same for the light transport. And the geometries can also be sampled and combined. This is previously anti-aliasing, especially TAA, and nowadays generally known as spatial supersampling, increasing the rendered spatial resolution, although using temporal information. So maybe someday, there's no need to deal with all the aggregation work. With some smart light transport methods, maybe we can really leave the ray tracing both between the objects and inside materials. About neural rendering, I've introduced a few projects of mine that uses neural networks. They can be counted as neural rendering, but more precisely, I'd rather call them neural-aided rendering, just like computer-aided design, or CAD. This is because I am still in control of the rendering process. I use neural networks to solve sub-problems that are either difficult or slow, and I do not expect neural networks to take over. In that sense, I share the same feeling with the presenters this morning. To combine neural-aided rendering with high performance, one must care about the lightweight use of neural networks, its efficient implementation, etc. As for reliable outputs, my understanding is that end-to-end solutions are often prone to errors because the output is directly shown to the users. That's why I was saying maybe focusing on a sub-problem would be better, because subsequent rendering process may perfectly hide potential issues. This is very similar to the final gathering process in the photo mapping method, right? But still, in order to accurately actually benefit performance, the inference of a neural network, either synchronized or running per thread, need to be performed even faster. Systems that allow writing neural network inference in shaders would be greatly appreciated. And the same applies to domain-specific languages and graphics hardware. The other thing I want to talk about is just photorealism itself, rather than performance in 2D. It used to be not so hard historically. The painters in the age of Renaissance have already proved it. And nowadays, the artists have not degenerated at all, as you can see from the pictures and this unfinished one. And I found this stunning graphics online. Let's take a look. So as you can see, the artist is adding more details to the drawing. And it's getting more and more realistic. But we cannot help wondering why in 3D the photorealistic rendering is so difficult, right? All right. Okay. So if we take a look at today's animation and video game, I think they're pretty good, right? So the Super Mario Bros. Movie and Diablo 4, that's good. And if we go back to 5 years ago, the graphics was still pretty good, as you can tell from the Coco movie and the game God of War. And another 5 years ago, that was still pretty good, looking at the Wreck-It Ralph and The Last of Us. And actually, I couldn't believe my eyes. I made sure that the image of The Last of Us is indeed from the 2013 version of it, rather than the recent remake. So that was really stunning, right? So what can we conclude? So there's no fundamental progress over the last 10 years. Okay. So on the contrary, I believe that we have made significant progress challenging the most difficult rendering problems, for example, the real-time global illumination. And we're now, unfortunately, in the uncanny valley, trying to get from 90% realism to 100% of realism. But this is difficult, right? It's like taking an exam. If you work hard, it's easy for you to get from 60 to 80, but getting from 90 to 100 is very difficult. But I still think it's promising. When we look at the demo enemies by Unity, we still cannot say that this is 100% accurate, but we're getting there. Okay. By the way, I really like the coincidence if you look at the subtitle of this specific frame that I took from this video and combined with the title I typed over there. You see, rendering today is given only those who dare. Okay. And is there anything that we can work on right now? Of course. At least I can say anything related to human is still problematic. For example, the accurate look of the eyes and the multiple scattering from hair and the peach fuzz layer on our skin that actually creates sheen and softens the boundary, and the skin itself, both its reflection and its subsurface scattering, and the makeup that is not only on the surface of the skin, but maybe in it, and the cloth that I've been working on, etc. So these are all difficult problems to accurate appearance, and that's just for human. And I actually think we still have time, so I can talk a little bit more. So the other thing I would like to share is actually already out of my area of expertise, but it's very interesting. Why? Let's take a look at the two different curves in this uncanny valley graph. Okay? So if you cannot read that clearly, I can do that for you. So the solid line curve, that is actually for still objects. And the dashed line objects curve is for moving objects. So from intuition, I actually guess maybe when the things are moving, I will focus less on its rendered realism. But if you look at these two curves, you can find that it's on the contrary. Moving objects is actually magnifying people's feelings, right? So this means that not only physically based rendering, physically based animation is also needed. And I'm not talking about the simulation, although they are often put together, but actually the photorealistic animation. And if you look at Siren, that was several years ago, you can still find it's rather unnatural for the movement, especially of the mouth and the muscles on the face, right? And I don't think it's completely solved with today's mocap technology. It still requires artists' work. So finally, the last question, are we good enough? My answer is that it's never good enough, especially if we want to climb out of the uncanny valley. And I myself certainly cannot represent the rendering academia, but my understanding is that even if there are smart tricks or hacks that can work perfectly, and even if there's AIGC, and in several years or decades may help us completely skip the analyzing process, we call ourselves scientists, so-called, okay? So I would often ask why behind all these solutions. And in this process, I think I've been enjoying it. Okay, so that's my understanding, and that concludes my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. We have plenty of time for questions, so whoever wants this thing, please raise your hand. There you go.
Hi, thank you for the excellent talk.
Thank
it
you.
was very insightful. I was wondering if maybe you could go into a little bit more detail about Roma and how it worked. You talked about capturing one rasterization and then rotating it, but I'm quite not sure I understood how that could work.
Okay, so let me go back to the Roma page. I think this one can, explain it better. So first, thank you for your question. And so here's how it works. So we perform rasterization of an object. So this object will be broken into different fragments, right? And these fragments, based on their position, we can calculate where it falls in the occupancy map. So this is classic method. So we will have the base occupancy map or BOM. And the second stage is that we create a big texture. And for the texture, we start a compute shader, or basically just CUDA. So to work individually on each texel. And, and we assume that this texture is an array that you can see something like this. Okay? So based on the texel ID, you can immediately know which view it belongs to, and where it stands in that view. And for each view, it's associated with a random direction, and that can be different per frame. But if we know that direction, and from the second step for every texel, we can just trace, write every bit of that texel step by step. And when we are moving along the texel inside this Roma, and it's actually moving in another direction on the BOM based on its rotation. And so we do this reading from BOM and writing on Roma, and there's no conflict of writing, so that's why this step is fast. So once you have this array, you will be able to use that, and you're given an array, and you can find the closest direction where that direction is rotated, like towards the depth of the texel on this Roma, and you can guarantee that these two directions are close enough, so you can do the snapping or not. Actually, even if you don't do that, I think the performance is still good. Like it will be converging like 5 to 8 steps based on our experiment. So yeah, I think that's a little bit detail that I can remember. Yeah, but still, if you want to learn more, so I think tomorrow's talk will be better. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's another question right behind you.
First of all, is this on? Yeah. First of all, excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it. One question to the neural methods, and you mentioned that animation is so important there. Have you any thoughts, or I'm wondering whether you have any insight on how to deal with neural methods and, let's say, changing geometry, right? How would you kind of integrate and combine that?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your question. And to repeat, and if I'm understanding it correctly, so when the geometry is changing, how can we still use the neural method to maybe capture its shape or like correlated or related appearance, right? Something like that. So I would like to say, previously, I don't trust in this until I read the paper of neural radiance caching, because that paper demonstrates that with a bit, actually quite a bit of engineering work, it is possible for the neural network to dynamically learn something with very limited budget of the time and very limited data. So if it can happen, for example, if you want to learn I know this is impossible just conceptually, okay? So if you want to learn the SDF of a morphable object, and whenever it changes the value of the SDF, you feed the new data to the neural network, and if it can actually learn that data and try to combine with the previous data learned already and give you a rather clean result, and that should be great. On the other hand, I haven't heard about any other cases where it is successfully trained online for the neural networks. So be cautious about that. That's basically my understanding. Thank you.
Thank you.
There's a question over there.
Oh.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your talk. So just carrying on about the neural rendering. So you say neural networks should be used to solve specific tasks so that you maintain control.
Yeah.
But you also say they should be lightweight. Is that important from an algorithmic point of view, or is it just because you're bottlenecked by the way GPUs currently work?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your question. So if I understand correctly, that's the it's about why do I need the neural network to wait. Let's see.
If you could use heavier weight neural networks, because a GPU could accelerate it.
So the sub-problems, right? So that's what you mean. So why I care about sub-problems?
No, I sort of agree that breaking it down to sub-problems is the right thing to do. I just wondered why the neural network that's solving the sub-problem needs to be lightweight. Is that just because you're bottlenecked by current technology?
Okay, thank you. I believe that's the same thing. So it's not always that the neural network need to be lightweight, but if it needs to be inferred per thread, for example, so when we're doing shading, so we definitely need to shade a point using or through a neural network, and it has to be inferred simultaneously and maybe not synchronized on the GPU. So I don't think it's very friendly to the GPU's architecture. This is one thing. And on the other hand, if we are talking about a neural network that is not so lightweight, if it is big, but if it's operating on the entire image, and I think if it needs to be inferred like once per frame, I think we can still afford that. So it is based on the different tasks. I should make this clear. So yeah, thank you. Okay.
More questions? This thing appears to be working again.
Nice talk. Concerning Uncanny Valley, I remember Marcus Gross, Professor Gross, speaking that we are in Uncanny Valley like 10 to 15 years ago. So, so actually, I think it's very, let's say, subjective, and some people already kind of think that perhaps we are already out of, or that we are at least going, not down, but going up. So, and ordinary people are, I think, sometimes they don't believe it was rendered. It's so subjective. So for you,
yes.
What's the estimate when we will get out of the of the valley?
Yeah. Thank you for this comment. I actually share the same feeling. I mean, it's been a while since I sit down and enjoy a movie, because when I'm looking at a movie, I can't help figuring out, okay, what is still bad, what can be improved, something like that. So yeah, maybe working on rendering has the ability to raise the bar of aesthetics, which is good, right? So if I have a certain higher bar in terms of realism, I would say today's rendering is still not good enough. But yeah, I mean, there are artists who are really picky about this result, and there are like ordinary users who thinks maybe like the graphics from 15 years ago, that's good enough. And that actually depends on the on different people's own opinions, as you mentioned, subjective, right? Yeah, so I totally agree with this. Yeah, but on the other hand, if I consider myself a scientist, if I still think something needs a little bit of improvement, that's what I should work on. Yeah, thank you.
Maybe I'll follow up here with another question. You have focused a lot on ultimate realism, or like a very high degree of quality, but ultimately we are making tools for artists. So what are your thoughts on the impact of graphics research and rendering research specifically on artist productivity?
Okay, thank you for your question. So yeah, I mean, this is a question about how to connect the scientific findings with the ease to use property from the artists, if I understand correctly, right? So yeah, we do need this kind of artist-friendly design to, for example, translate the physically based parameters into those parameters that are more intuitive. For example, the shininess is a typical like interpretation, which is often replaced by the roughness here in the academia, right? So I think that's one successful case, and I believe some work to connect the developers and artists, that's very important. And I don't see a problem like pursuing the ultra realism, and I don't see if that'll, for example, introduce more parameters that is really hard to control. Yeah, at least for now, yeah. So I think it's still good. Thank you.
Sense. Thanks.
Okay.
We still have a few minutes. So, yeah, there's a question. Okay, maybe we'll need. Oh, that only half the thing flew. I'll just give you the other microphone.
I fixed it.
Okay.
Great talk. And do you think that AI will be the solution to solve the uncanny valley problem, especially for our animations?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your question. So will AI be the ultimate solution for us to jump out of the uncanny valley? So I'm actually cautious about this because on one hand, I have seen the possibilities and potentials brought by, for example, AIGC, its success on the 2D content creation. And I also see some successful applications try to, for example, generate the 3D contents and maybe even the NERF contents in different ways using the AI. So I assume people are still exploring different ways and see if it can actually work to get the 3D content. But I have actually two questions about that. One is that, do we really need 3D contents? With 3D contents, we have the geometry, we have the lighting, we have the materials, and inevitably, we have to combine them using what we know, which is the rendering equation, which is also wrong, which is also not able to create the wrong in the sense of wave optics research as I did. Okay, I should provide more context. Yeah, okay, so, but we do know that as a rendering researcher, I'm not content with the rendered realism yet. So as long as the generated content is in 3D, I can say it's unlikely to be photorealistic, at least for now. So the other question arises, right? So what would be a good representation as I've been trying to explore? So these traditional methods, the voxels, the triangles, including NERF, they have their own pros and cons. So if AI wants to do better, I think maybe AI should also explore some better forms to represent all these kind of geometry and appearance. And I believe that's the right way. So going back, so this is one thing I have seen its potential, and the other thing, on the other hand, I am still keeping an eye on it. I hope there's a success, and yeah, but I also wouldn't 100% rely on that. That's my personal opinion. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, last call. Any more questions? Apparently not. In that case, I think Elmar has a few more things to say about the upcoming boat tour. So I'll hand it over.
Thank you.